One of the most important aspects of historical apologetics for the person of Jesus, for the reliability of the Gospels, is source criticism of the Gospels.
While Ken Ham may have shattered my young earth creation beliefs, it was source criticism of the Bible that led me to the conclusion that the Christian Holy Book is not reliable. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. If you're not already, why not tap on the subscribe button to be notified when there are new videos of an ex-evangelical's take on Christian science, philosophy, and theology. Today we'll be watching the latest video offering from William Lane Craig that asks the question, are the four Gospels independent sources?
The modern New Testament scholar doesn't simply quote from the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of John. Rather, he tries to discern the sources upon which the evangelists drew in writing their Gospels.
This may come as a surprise, but I'm going to be praising Craig for some intellectual honesty in this video, saying some things that many evangelical Christians wouldn't want to hear, if he were saying them plainly.
The modern New Testament scholar,
Craig is setting up a caveat for the kinds of scholars who will be able to agree with what he's about to present. There are modern New Testament scholars, and then there are, what? Traditional New Testament scholars? The kind who don't practice source criticism he mentioned in the opening? The kind who don't examine how the Bible came to be? Just blindly affirming what it says? I'm with Craig on this so far.
he tries to discern the sources upon which the evangelists drew in writing their Gospels.
Now, this is something that a lot of Christians may not want to hear. Craig agrees that the Gospel writers don't just sit down and merely commit to blank parchment their personal recollections and memoirs. Instead, they draw upon other sources, the way a college student might consult Wikipedia. Also note that Craig referred to the Gospel writers as evangelists, not apostles, not eyewitnesses. He's right. All we can say for sure about these authors was that they wanted others to become Christians. Kudos for that honesty.
Luke, for example, refers to the many people who have tried to write an account of the things that have transpired concerning Jesus of Nazareth. And he says that having consulted these, he will now attempt to give an orderly account of his own.
Again, to be clear, this affirms that the author of Luke was not an eyewitness to the events, but rather a collector and a compiler of anecdotes. Craig acknowledges that this gospel is at best second-hand, but could just as well be 20th hand, if indeed the traditions within have any historical basis at all.
The other gospel writers also draw upon earlier traditions, whether written or more likely oral traditions that come to be embodied in their Gospels.
This sounds like it's going to be complicated. Maybe we should use a diagram. Okay, according to Craig, the writers drew upon earlier oral traditions. And by oral tradition, he means things that members of the early church talked about. Any story repeated multiple times could become part of this oral tradition, without much differentiation between those with historical veracity and the exaggerations or fabrications that one neighbor might innocently pass along to another neighbor in an effort to convince them to avoid burning in hell. Whatever people would repeat is what ended up in the oral tradition. For example, many people believe that undercover police officers are required to identify themselves when asked, or that someone must be gone 24 hours before a missing person report can be filed. Neither of these things are true in the vast majority of U.S. jurisdictions, yet false oral traditions that persist today arose around these alleged policies, even though they're easily shown false with even the most basic checking.
This is very helpful to the task of Christian evidences, because even though Matthew and Luke probably drew upon Mark, and therefore are not independent of Mark.
You're probably aware that large sections of Mark were directly copied, often word for word in the original Greek. Matthew contains 94% of Mark's material, and Luke contains 79% of Mark. So indeed, they are not independent of Mark.
For example, in addition to Mark, most scholars think that Luke and Matthew drew upon another source that is arbitrarily called the Q document, which was a source of sayings of Jesus, teachings of Jesus, rather than an account of the events of his life. And they blended the material from this source with Mark's gospel in writing their own gospels.
As Craig describes, alongside the material taken from Mark, about a quarter of Matthew and Luke overlap each other, and scholars hypothesize a document called the Q source. Q actually stands for Quelle, the German word for source. Not completely arbitrary.
So if you can show that something is attested both in Mark and in Q, then you're dealing with independent sources.
In order to know something is from the Q source, it would need to appear in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. But if it's not in Mark, then it can't be in both Mark and Q. At first glance, this makes no sense at all. But, maybe due to sloppy editing, there are actually a few stories that are seemingly inexplicably told twice in Matthew and twice in Luke, but also doubled up with the very same wording. This is a bit of forensic clue that these phrases were in both Mark and Q. So what kind of information can we be extra sure of because of this double attestation? Well, none of the events of Jesus' life, or any of the supernatural parts, just barely a handful of tertiary sayings attributed to Jesus. The most famous of which is probably the command for disciples to deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Hardly history affirming. And what Craig glosses over are the possibilities that Mark had access to Q, or that Q had access to Mark, or the absolute certainty that Q is also based on the same oral tradition that arose surrounding Jesus. Traditions are basically memes, so you're going to see them pop up in multiple places.
Luke and Matthew and Mark are normally thought to be independent of John. This is significant because when you find in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, an account of the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, and you also find an account of the triumphal entry in John, you have independent accounts of the same event.
Regardless of what dates they advocate for, most scholars affirm that John was written several decades after Mark. Acclaimed New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham, among others, have laid out detailed arguments that the author of the Gospel of John in fact used the Gospel of Mark as a template. He just didn't go so far as to copy the exact wording of Mark. Like maybe John was meant to be a companion piece. The fact that believing Christians dispute the independence of Mark and John should be enough to say that such independence is at least unclear. And if we for some reason assume that the author of John didn't have access to Mark, it is virtually impossible to imagine that the author wasn't intimately familiar with the now decades older oral tradition that gave rise to Mark in the first place.
Paul then provides additional independent information about Jesus. The letters of Paul have been called a fifth gospel.
I've never actually heard anyone call the letters of Paul a fifth gospel. When I did a search on this, most of the results were for a novel by Ian Caldwell. But other articles are calling the book of Isaiah the fifth gospel, or the nation of Israel the fifth gospel, or the Gospel of Thomas, or the work of St. Jerome. Seems there are more fifth gospels than fifth Beatles. Not important, but this phrasing doesn't seem common.
In Paul's letters, you can read about Jesus' life, his teaching.
Of course, the obvious problem here is that, as far as we know, historical Saul never met historical Jesus. So nothing Paul would have to say about Jesus could be anything more than just repeating what others told him. It would be affirmation of what others believed about Jesus' life. In other words, the oral tradition.
His miracles.
As far as I know, and as far as I can find in my research, Paul does not mention any of the miracles of Jesus, unless you count his resurrection, which Craig is going to bring up later.
His Last Supper, his betrayal.
The extent of Paul's description of the betrayal is on the night Jesus was betrayed in 1 Corinthians 11:23. But the verses that follow do describe the Last Supper, and in a way that lines up well with the Last Supper narrative in Luke 22. The Greek words for received and delivered are consistent with language used in Jewish circles to refer to traditions being handed down. So this is not something Paul claims to have first-hand knowledge of. So, at best, Paul is relaying some oral tradition. The interesting part about whether this should count as a separate source from the Gospels is that there is a significant textual variant in Luke 22:19-20. Some of the earliest copies of Luke don't include the words that make the account line up with Paul's version. By all appearances, later scribes changed these verses in Luke to make them seem more like Corinthians. Once again, this cross-pollination and copying further erodes confidence that we're actually dealing with multiple sources.
His crucifixion, his burial, his resurrection from the dead.
Ah yes, the portion of 1 Corinthians 15 that apologists are so anxious to insist is an early church creed. A poem of recitation, as you will. Calling it a creed can help place the phrases earlier in history, but it cannot help Craig's claim in this video that Paul's usage should be considered a fifth source. It's either Paul's words, or it's the word of Christians from before Paul's conversion. It can't be both.
So that's what's meant by independent sources. It's not just talking about the Gospels, but it's dealing with the sources upon which the Gospels and Paul drew, which are independent of one another.
But you in no way demonstrated that the sources upon which the Gospels and Paul drew were independent. While the oral tradition about the beliefs of Jesus would have had variations, The reason it can be called a tradition at all is that there was enough commonality in the intermingled stories to be recognized. That said, this wasn't a useless exercise, for if, before today, you happen to believe that the Bible was based on eyewitness testimony of the authors, well, then I'm glad that William Lane Craig was here to be the respected, Bible-believing, PhD-holding Christian who can inform you directly that such notions are not supported by scholarship or evidence. Thanks for watching. This might be a good chance to review my How Christianity Probably Got Started Without a Resurrection video, or something else from the Apologetics playlist. See you there.